Once upon a time, they came to the tomb. They came to seek the body of their friend and rabbi, their teacher, Jesus, and he wasn't there. Once upon a time, these women brought spices to their friend Jesus, but he wasn't there. He had risen. The grave was empty. Once upon a time. This is how we are to not think about the resurrection. Once upon a time is how we talk about events that have started and finished at some finite point in history, and which, besides sort of inspiring us with the events, do not directly affect us. And so once upon a time makes a good start to a fairy tale, and some of you may be thinking of stories right now that start with once upon a time, but these are not the words with which we are to think about the resurrection. The resurrection should not be understood as a finite, once-upon-a-time event in history, but rather as something which occurred that touches all of history and that affects all times and all places. You see, the resurrection, while it was most certainly a historical event, and many, many historians have come to understand that the most compelling explanation of the emergence of the Christian church was and is a true bodily resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, the empty tomb. That event most certainly happened. However, unlike all other events in history, it does not stay there in its finite happening, but rather has an effect on all that came before and all that comes after. And so truly, as we look at the resurrection, it is not once upon a time, but it is something that lives and breathes through us and through the rest of all of human history, including our lives. It becomes the focal point, the hinge of history on which all other history depends. Let me give an analogy to a game which some of you play and many of us watch, the game of golf. And in fact, there happens to be a golf tournament going on this weekend, isn't there? Somewhere in Augusta, Georgia. I know I'll be watching Phil go for his 4th Masters championship this afternoon. But my point is, talking about an analogy of golf, we often see the final victorious shot happen on the 18th hole. And the champion, whether it is Phil or Tiger or Annika or Michelle Wie, makes that final putt and triumphantly pumps the arm, raises the fist on the 18th green. And that's the championship. But any of you who have played golf or who watch golf know that that is not the most important shot in the championship. The most important shot may have been on Thursday or Friday or Saturday. It may have been on the 8th hole. It may have been on the 10th hole. It may have been that perfect chip shot that saved par on the 11th hole on Saturday, and you go back to that spot and say that shot was the central point of that championship match. Yes, the 18th hole green shot becomes the celebration, but in the analysis, they'll say, oh no, it was on Saturday at the 10th hole that the championship was won, that the shot which clinched the championship occurred, and all of the rest of the round needs to be understood through that shot in the middle. Everything that happened before that shot and everything that happened after that shot becomes seen through the lens of that central championship shot in the middle. The resurrection is sort of like that. The resurrection, this hinge of history through which then we understand all of history through the lens of Jesus rising from the dead. It was an event with such power, with such earth-shattering significance, that all other events must be seen through it. The next slide, I have kind of an example of this. History, we understand in a timeline. And so we often point events in history on a timeline. So you could sort of point the resurrection on the timeline like that, things that have gone before and after it. But if what I'm saying is the way we should really see the resurrection, it would be more like this. the resurrection in the center and history stemming from it, and then understanding all events as seen through the lens of the resurrection would be more like the next diagram. Including our own lives, we can understand as all of human history as being seen through the lens of Christ raised from that tomb in Jerusalem, just as a championship golf match can be seen through the lens of that one turning point shot. But here's where the analogy breaks down. Here's where my golf analogy breaks down. You see, Tiger and Annika and Phil and Michelle, they win golf tournaments for themselves. They play to win for them and their families and those close to them. Their turning point, their championship is for them. But the resurrection, Jesus' death and resurrection, the empty tomb, that was for you. The cross, the grave, the empty tomb, the triumph over death, it was not for himself, it was for you. It was for each one of us. It was for every single man, woman, and child in the entire world. Think about that for a moment. You know, Christianity is sometimes accused of being irrelevant or out of touch. And yet here we are with this fundamental claim that Jesus came and lived and died and resurrected that we might have new life with him. And in fact, if you had been the only person that had ever lived, he would have still done it just for you. He loves us that much. What could be more relevant than that? You know, they came to Jesus and they asked him, "Why have you come? To teach, to preach, to do miracles, to heal?" And Jesus replied, "Well, I came that they might have life and have it abundantly." He came that we might share in the resurrected life that he brings to all people. And we began then to see, through the power of the resurrection, that all of our life can be seen with the lens, the glasses of new life. He said that he came to bring life, and then he proved it. He proved it because the hardest place to bring life would be death itself. And God raised him from death itself and firmly proved that resurrection life, new life, is possible in any circumstance. God did it, God is doing it, and God will do it for all who desire that new life. And so it is for us who have been confronted with the reality of the resurrection that we must look at the world through our resurrection glasses, through the lens of the resurrection in every situation, asking with expectation, how can God bring new life out of even this? We grieve in life, and yet even in our grief, we can look for new life. Whether it is addiction, and we grieve for addiction, but we look through the lens of the resurrection, we say, here even God can bring new life. We grieve for death and sickness, and Jesus grieved for the death of his friend. But through the lens of the resurrection, we look at this and say, even in the midst of death and sickness, God can bring new life. We grieve for our children. We look at the difficult world that may be ahead of them, and we grieve. And yet, as we nurture them in the faith, we say that even here, even through the peaks and valleys of life, the difficulties for our children, God will bring new life for them. I know some of you might be thinking, well, that's okay for other people's situation. I can see how God might bring new life and hope for somebody else's situation, but for me and my broken relationships and my peaks and valleys, it's just hopeless. And while there might be hope in other situations for God to bring new life, not in my situation, it is utterly hopeless. Hopeless like a crucified Messiah. Hopeless like an innocent man condemned, abandoned, betrayed, and tortured, and left out to dry. Sealed behind a thick rock tomb. Hopeless like that. In every situation, in any situation, God says that there is hope. And on Easter Sunday, we fully proclaim that death and hopelessness does not get the last word. God gets the last word. Life gets the last word. Hope gets the last word. Sisters and brothers, this is Easter, and we are a resurrection people. Once upon a time, they came to the tomb, and Jesus was not there, for he had risen from the dead. That was the event. But the story is not once upon a time. The story is that in all times and in all places, there is resurrection life. In all places, in every age, in every culture, in every heart, God has spoken, God is speaking. God has given, God is giving. New life, resurrected life to all of God's children. Amen. And now I invite all of God's children to help me build a parable. We're going to build a parable up here. This is the hopeless cross right up here. This is the dead cross right up here. We're going to build a parable of what God does with hopeless situations.